They called it brotherhood. Police called it one of the most violent outlaw motorcycle gangs in the world. The Mongols Motorcycle Club was formed in 1969 in Montebello, California, by men who felt rejected by the biker elite and hardened by war. What followed was not rebellion for show, but decades of bloodshed, turf wars, ambushes, and open conflict with rival clubs, especially the Hells Angels. Their name became synonymous with escalation. By the 2000s, the Mongols were no longer just an American problem. Chapters appeared across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, often bringing violence with them. Then came Australia. In 2013, through a rapid patchover with local riders, the Mongols planted their flag in one of the world's most heavily policed biker environments. Authorities warned it would end badly. They were right. Shootings, arsons, mass raids, and emergency anti-bikie laws followed. Rival clubs mobilized, governments reacted. So was this a bold global expansion or a fatal miscalculation? And when the Mongols hit Australia, did they gain ground or trigger a crackdown they couldn't survive? Subscribe to the channel. Let's begin. The Mongols Motorcycle Club was born out of exclusion, frustration, and war. On December 5th, 1969, in Montebello, California, a small group of riders came together after being shut out of established motorcycle clubs. Many were Vietnam War veterans, men who had returned home, hardened by combat and disillusioned by how little they felt they belonged. They didn't ask for permission. They built their own brotherhood. They called themselves the Mongols Motorcycle Club. The name was deliberate. It evoked conquest, fear, and defiance. Loyalty above all, retaliation without hesitation. This was not a social riding club. It was a closed circle, and once you were in, walking away was not simple. By the early 1970s, the Mongols leaned fully into the one-percenter identity. They embraced the outlaw label publicly, recruiting not just from biker circles, but from prisons and street crews across Southern California. Violence was not discouraged. It was expected. Prospects were chosen for toughness and silence, not polish. One decision would define their future more than any other. The Mongols adopted a California bottom rocker, a patch claiming the entire state. In outlaw biker culture, that was more than symbolism. It was a challenge, a line drawn in public, and it directly provoked the dominant force of the time, the Hells Angels. What followed was inevitable. By the mid-1970s, tension turned into open hostility. The infamous Anaheim motorcycle swap meet brawl on March 11th, 1977 was only the beginning. That conflict would soon explode into ambushes, drive-by shootings, and deaths that pulled law enforcement into the fight. Those early years forged the Mongols' identity. Violence became structured. Territory became currency. Brotherhood became enforcement. What started as 10 riders in Montebello evolved into something far more dangerous, a disciplined organization built to expand, endure, and escalate. And once that foundation was set, the Mongols didn't stay local for long. The Mongols didn't build their name quietly. Their reputation was carved out in public, violent clashes that left little room for denial. By the mid-1970s, tension with the Hells Angels was already thick in Southern California. All it took was one spark. On March 11th, 1977, that spark ignited at a crowded motorcycle swap meet in Anaheim, California. 9 Hells Angels walked into an event dominated by Mongols members. What followed was not a scuffle. It was a full-scale riot. Fists, chains, knives. Dozens were injured. The message was clear. Coexistence was over. Just months later, on July 7th, 1977, the Hells Angels formally voted to declare war on the Mongols. That vote turned rivalry into open season. The violence that followed was fast and brutal. Between July and September 1977, multiple Mongols members were killed in shootings across California. On July 29th, Mongols rider Alan Bishop was shot while riding his motorcycle in Kern County. Weeks later, on September 5th, 2 San Diego Mongols, Raymond Jingles Smith and Emerson Redbeard Morris, were gunned down by automatic rifle fire on Interstate 15 near Escondido. The war didn't stay between clubs. An innocent 15-year-old boy was killed in the crossfire, shocking the public and drawing heavy law enforcement attention. Bombings, drive-by shootings, and ambushes began spilling into neighborhoods, funerals, and highways. Even mourning wasn't safe. This feud exposed 2 hard truths. First, the Mongols were willing to escalate far beyond fists, using planned ambushes and high-powered weapons. Second, the fight wasn't just about people, it was about symbols. The California bottom rocker wasn't decoration to the Mongols, it was a claim. To the Hells Angels, it was an insult that demanded blood. Violence became both message and method. Recruitment hardened. Prospects were pulled from prisons and street crews already comfortable with force. By the time federal investigations intensified, years later, the Mongols had already proven something dangerous. They could survive war. But survival came at a price. More enemies, harsher laws, and a reputation sealed in blood. And that violence-fueled identity pushed the Mongols beyond California and onto a much bigger stage. What began as a small crew in Southern California didn't stay local for long. By the early 2000s, the Mongols Motorcycle Club had turned itself into a global brand. Law enforcement estimates now place their membership at around 4,000 to 5,000 full-patch members, with chapters or affiliates operating in more than 25 countries. That scale alone put them among the largest outlaw motorcycle clubs in the world. This growth followed a pattern. The Mongols kept a mother chapter structure rooted in California. New chapters needed approval, paid dues, and were expected to follow orders from senior leadership. Patches were not just symbols of brotherhood, they were licenses. Once approved, chapters were free to build locally, as long as money flowed upward and loyalty flowed inward. It was less a loose club, and more a franchise backed by violence. Recruitment played a major role. Like many outlaw gangs, the Mongols drew heavily from prison populations, where loyalty, reputation, and willingness to use force already mattered. Released inmates often became prospects, bringing connections to drug markets and street crews. That pipeline helped chapters establish themselves quickly in new regions. US law enforcement began seeing the results. Federal investigations in the late 1990s and early 2000s tied Mongols members to drug trafficking, weapons offences, and racketeering. Multi-state raids uncovered illegal firearms, stolen motorcycles, and narcotics, confirming the club was operating far beyond weekend rides. Internationally, chapters appeared across Europe, Canada, Mexico, and parts of Asia. Some followed the California model closely, others were looser, using the Mongols name for protection and status in local criminal markets. Either way, the patch carried weight and consequences. For authorities, this created a nightmare. The Mongols weren't just violent in one place, they were mobile, connected, and adaptive. Pressure in one country could push activity elsewhere. Money, people, and influence crossed borders faster than laws could keep up. By the time the Mongols looked toward Australia, they weren't experimenting anymore. They were exporting a system already tested through decades of conflict. And wherever that system landed, instability followed. The Mongols didn't drift into Australia, they arrived with force. In October 2013, the Mongols Motorcycle Club pulled off one of the boldest moves the Australian bikie scene had ever seen. Through a rapid patchover of the Finks Motorcycle Club, the Mongols absorbed the vast majority of Finks members nationwide. Police later estimated that around 90% of the Finks national membership switched colours. Overnight, a US-based outlaw club gained instant territory, manpower and infrastructure across several states. This wasn't organic growth, it was a takeover. Australia was already tense. Years of bikie violence had pushed governments to introduce some of the strictest anti-outlaw motorcycle gang laws in the world. Police intelligence units had repeatedly warned that the arrival of a major international club would destabilise the fragile balance between local gangs. The Mongols were known globally for aggressive expansion and retaliation. Senior officers publicly warned their entry would inevitably lead to conflict. Within months, Mongols chapters appeared in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, and Western Australia. Clubhouses were established, patches were worn openly. This visibility was deliberate. In outlaw culture, showing colours is a claim of ownership. The message was simple. The Mongols weren't visiting. They were planting a flag, but the patchover came at a price. Not every Finks member accepted the change. Some refused to wear Mongols colours, others defected to rival clubs. Long-standing friendships collapsed overnight. Old loyalties turned into grudges, and those grudges didn't fade quietly. Behind the scenes, leadership structures were rewritten. Mongols' rules replaced local customs. Discipline tightened. Loyalty was tested. What had once been an Australian club answering to Australian figures was now tied to an international hierarchy with expectations set offshore. Law enforcement reacted fast. Surveillance increased. Dedicated task forces expanded. Clubhouses were monitored, vehicles were tracked, authorities understood the risk. Imported rivalries and global reputations don't stay contained. The Mongols had achieved their first objective, a foothold, but Australia was not California. The laws were harsher, the scrutiny constant, and the rivals were already armed, organised and watching closely. The invasion had worked. Now came the reckoning. When the Mongols Motorcycle Club planted itself in Australia, the ground shifted fast. The 2013 patchover didn't just add numbers, it rewired territory. Chapters across New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia became pressure points, and pressure turned into violence. The pattern was familiar and brutal. Nighttime arsons torched clubhouses and vehicles in industrial estates. Targeted assaults erupted in bars and licensed venues. Public roads became risk zones as rivalries moved from back rooms into open space. Police task forces reported a steady drumbeat of raids and arrests tied to Mongols chapters, firearms seized, prohibited weapons uncovered, and drug charges stacked alongside extortion and conspiracy counts. In several multi-state operations through the mid to late 2010s, authorities seized dozens of illegal firearms and detained nearly 20 suspects at a time. Snapshots of how quickly weaponry and organisation had taken root. In November 2019, a pre-dawn drive along Melbourne's East Link ended in tragedy when two Mongols members opened fire on a van, killing an innocent grocer in what prosecutors later described as a mistaken identity ambush. The case shocked the public because it exposed the spillover risk. This wasn't club-on-club violence contained to the shadows. It was lethal force on a commuter highway. The shooters were later sentenced to decades in prison, a grim marker of how far the conflict had escalated. Inside the scene, fractures widened. Not all former Finks accepted Mongols' colours. Defections and splinters created fresh grudges, and recruitment drives became provocations. Patch offers were read as land grabs. Retaliation became ritual. Compromise all but vanished. Police expanded dedicated Bicky task forces, increased surveillance and leaned on anti-association laws, but enforcement often chased sparks after they flew. Territory had become an active battlefield. Streets, clubhouses and highways turned into chessboards, and every move risked another reply. Next, we trace the high-profile cases that hardened public outrage. The Mongols' impact stopped being theoretical the moment gunfire cut through Melbourne's morning traffic. On November 9, 2019, Paul Vergona, a 46-year-old fruiterer, was driving to work on the Eastlink freeway when a stolen car pulled alongside his van. 11 shots were fired. Vergona was hit 7 times and died at the scene. Prosecutors later proved the attack was mistaken identity, a gang hit that found the wrong target. 2 Mongols members were convicted. Josh Ryder, who pleaded guilty and received 30 years, and Aaron Ong, found guilty at trial and sentenced to 35 years with a lengthy non-parole period. The message was chilling. This war could kill anyone. That killing cracked the facade. Police operations that followed exposed how the club functioned day to day. In December 2020, a national day of action led to 18 arrests and the seizure of nearly 30 firearms, plus drugs and cash. In 2021, coordinated work by the National Anti-Gang Squad across states removed close to 100 firearms from outlaw networks. Each raid revealed the same patterns: hidden weapons caches near clubhouses and drug supply lines using chapters as distribution points. In the Northern Territory, a long-running investigation known as Operation Morley culminated in around 40 arrests, including alleged national figures disrupting suspected methamphetamine routes and financial flows. Courtrooms filled with charges: firearms possession, trafficking, extortion, and conspiracy. Sentences stacked into decades. Assets were seized, colours came off walls, but consequences cut both ways. Arrests sometimes fractured leadership and triggered retaliation. Arson attacks flared. Daylight assaults rattled suburbs. Every conviction brought relief and proof of how deep the problem ran. For the public, fear became personal. Highways, bars, and quiet streets felt exposed. For police, the fight turned permanent. Surveillance, raids, prosecutions, repeat. And for families like the Vergonas, justice could not restore what was taken. The question was no longer whether the Mongols posed a risk. It was how far authorities would go to dismantle a machine that treated violence as management, and what it would take to finally slow it down. The Mongols didn't just bring violence, They forced the system to evolve. By the late 2000s and 10s, Australian police accepted that isolated raids weren't enough. This wasn't a local gang problem anymore. It was a national organised crime threat, and the response became coordinated, relentless, and precise. State crime commands, the Australian Federal Police, and the National Anti-Gang Squad began operating as a single machine. The strategy was clear: take the guns, follow the money, remove the people giving orders. One of the first public signals came in December 2020, when a nationwide day of action targeted the Mongols and their associates. 18 people were arrested across multiple states. Police seized nearly 30 firearms, along with drugs, cash, and stolen vehicles. It wasn't about one case. It was a warning shot. The pressure didn't ease. In 2021, the National Anti-Gang Squad reported seizing 99 firearms in a single year from outlaw motorcycle gangs nationwide, alongside millions of dollars in suspected criminal assets. Many of those weapons were unregistered, modified, or hidden in rural properties and storage units, places chosen to keep them away from traffic stops and routine searches. In the Northern Territory, a long-running probe culminated in a major operation that led to around 40 arrests. Police seized more than 30 firearms, over 1 kilogram of methamphetamine, large quantities of cannabis, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Investigators said the operation targeted alleged national and state-level figures, people responsible for logistics, weapons storage, and drug movement. But raids were only part of the plan. Police leaned hard on firearm prohibition orders, allowing officers to search suspected members without warrants. Proceeds of crime laws were used to seize houses, vehicles, and bank accounts. Immigration checks, licensing crackdowns, and covert surveillance squeezed the club from every angle. Clubhouses were watched, interstate runs were tracked, recruitment slowed. The results were real, but messy. Weapons came off the streets, leaders went to prison, supply lines fractured. But pressure also caused internal fractures. With senior figures locked up, factions competed for control, old alliances broke, new grudges formed, violence didn't disappear. It shifted. Law enforcement had forced the Mongols onto the back foot. They had taken space, time, and resources away from the club, but they hadn't erased it. And that left one final question hanging in the air. After all the raids, arrests, and laws, what was left of the Mongols in Australia? And did they still matter? By the early 2020s, the picture was no longer clear-cut. The Mongols were still in Australia, but the momentum that followed the 2013 patchover was gone. What replaced it was pressure. Constant, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Chapters remained active across several states, but cohesion suffered. In Victoria, senior figures were arrested or removed through court orders and firearms bans triggering internal rifts. Meetings became risky. Clubhouses drew attention instead of respect. Surveillance cars parked nearby sent a quiet message. Every move was being watched. Defections followed. Some members walked away, others were pushed out. Command fractured. The numbers told a colder story. Over the decade, hundreds of Mongols members and associates were arrested nationwide. Courts handed down long prison sentences, including multiple decades for serious violence. Proceeds of crime laws stripped vehicles, cash, and properties, leaving chapters financially weakened. Recruitment slowed. Wearing the patch no longer meant power. It meant being known to police. But the Mongols didn't vanish. Smaller groups adapted. Visibility dropped. Public rides stopped. Movement shifted to interstate corridors and outer suburbs, where chapters tried to regroup quietly. Intelligence units tracked these patterns, noting short-term alliances and cautious attempts to rebuild. In some regions, rivals moved in and took ground. In others, stalemates formed. No club willing to push hard enough to trigger another crackdown. What changed most was fear. In the beginning, rivals feared the Mongols' reputation and international backing. By the end, Mongols members feared certainty, the certainty of surveillance, of raids, of asset seizures, of long sentences. Australia's layered enforcement model, combining intelligence, finance, and preemptive policing, proved difficult to outmaneuver. Expansion invited attention. Attention brought consequences. Today, the Mongols are still classified as an outlaw motorcycle gang. They are monitored, mapped, and anticipated. Their moves rarely surprise anyone anymore. So did they hold Australia? They arrived fast. They forced confrontation. They left scars on rivals, on streets, on innocent lives. But the promised takeover never fully arrived. What remains is a reduced, cautious presence, alive but constrained. In Australia's underworld, survival doesn't always mean winning. Sometimes it just means not being erased. And for the Mongols, that may be the final balance sheet. So, the Mongols Motorcycle Club arrived in Australia with numbers, reputation, and a global name built on intimidation. What they found instead was a country willing to push back with relentless pressure, long sentences, and laws designed to break organised crime from the inside out. The violence left scars on streets, on families, and on a biker landscape that will likely never return to what it was before. But history leaves us with two questions. Did Australia stop a global outlaw takeover or merely force it into the shadows? And if the Mongols learn to adapt here, what does that mean for the future of organised biker crime worldwide? Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe for more crime stories. Thanks for watching.